Hello, Graham from ArionGames here, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Advanced Fighting Fantasy Quickstart. So, you might wonder why I'm holding a copy of this if I'm talking about the Quickstart. Well, the Quickstart, which is free on DriveThruRPG, and I'll put a link to it underneath the video, is essentially the first section from the core rulebook. Now, when we first published the core rulebook, I wanted to partly mimic Dungeoneer and partly mimic the original Fighting Fantasy RPG book. In both of those, they are portrayed very much as an introduction to RPGs. And I think for people in the UK, that is pretty fundamental. Many people of my generation who got into RPGs through the Fighting Fantasy game books were also brought in through those early AFF RPGs. And they both portrayed themselves as very easy to run, and they are. It's a very, very simple system. You've got huge advantages to starting in RPGs with the game books because you roll your skill, you've got your stamina, you've got your luck. That's your basic system. And if you can run through a game book, you can play the RPG. So one way I introduce new people to this RPG is to give them a copy of one of the game books, which of course are still being published, and say, go on then, play that. Because if they can play that, when they come to the table to play the RPG, all they have to do is add in a few extra rules about special skills, about magic, about talents and so on. But otherwise, the core mechanic is still the same. And I wanted this to be a good introductory RPG as well as one that can be used for long-term gaming. So we put in this section here, the introductory role-playing game. So it's a very slightly stripped down version. So you still have special skills, but you don't have talents. There are some pre-generated characters in the quick start, and these allow you to get going very, very quickly, and they offer some classic archetypes. So you have an elf wizard, you have a human rogue, you have an elf archer, you have a tough dwarf fighter, etc. So you've got some classic archetypes there, and you've got a fairly standard fighting fantasy type dungeon. I'll only put that up briefly because I don't want to spoil it if you're actually going to run through it. But you've got monsters to fight. You've got classic monsters, you've got goblins and skeletons and so on and so forth. You've got traps. You've got typical puzzles like the alternating black and white tiles that glow. You've got alternative traps like the big pit with the sort of two short sections sticking out over it. Do you jump it? Do you try and find another way across? Do you look for ropes? Do you, etc.? So you've got all these classic traps. You've also got very much a Marmite type of thing in Fighting Fantasy, which in this dungeon is the Dwarf Cafe. Now this comes from one of the older books, and if you know the older books, you know what I'm talking about. So you've got some dwarves who run a cafe in the middle of the dungeon, and this sort of illustrates two opposing sides to Fighting Fantasy. One of them is that many Fighting Fantasy dungeons, so we're talking about the game books here, don't make any sense. So there is no built-in ecology. If you were to study it as a scientist, there is no way they're going to get their food and their water and their airflow and waste disposal and so on. Many Fighting Fantasy game books are like that, and you've got, an ogre in one room, and the only way out is either through the orcs or through the goblins. So is he their boss or is he set? And these don't make sense. But part of the charm of Fighting Fantasy is the fact that these don't make sense, which is fine. But then you've also got certain bits that try to make sense. So in the final book of the sorcery game books, you've got the foul privy at the edge of the Mampang fortress. And if I remember right, you can catch horrible disease from it and so on. That is a slice of reality in the Fighting Fantasy dungeon. And similarly here, you've got a cafe. So this dungeon attracts adventurers from all over the place. They come in, many of them don't survive. So their money gets looted, spent in the dungeon with the dwarves who run the cafe. Does it really make sense? Not really. But you can also argue, well, why not? If you've got all these monsters that are effectively harvesting gold pieces from unsuccessful adventurers, they're going to need somewhere to spend it, aren't they? They're going to need something to do with it. They're not just going to hoard it. And why not have a cafe that produces Pookie's stew and orc ale and so on? But of course, it also then gives players who are used to maybe more serious sort of dungeon, it gives them just a smiling moment, because you're used to going into a room and there's orcs or there's trolls or there's goblins or whatever, and in this you go into the room and there's a counter and food and tables, and you can drink the orc ale and get drunk and end up having a fight with your other adventurer mates. You can eat the gloister, which restores luck. You can talk to the dwarves, you can get information, etc. So it's something just a little bit different to take away the edge of, we go into this room, we fight something, or we go into this room and we solve a trap, or we go into this room and we solve a puzzle. Apart from those, you've got this little interaction, and I think it's what sets fighting fantasy apart. Now, this introductory dungeon, this quick start, has the little sections for you to read out. So you go into room 7 and it says the corridor stretches for only 10 metres or so before coming to a rubble-strewn end. Littered across the floor are several broken picks, hammers and spades. Your attention is drawn by a scratching noise to the furthest part of the wall, where a solitary pick appears to be feebly working all by itself. Now again, this is featured in several Fighting Fantasy game books. But if you are running a role-playing game for the first time, if you've never games mastered, you've never run a game, you can read the sections, and the bit below tells you how to run that room. Now, I know that there are plenty of games that do this, but this has a really, really easy mechanic. It has the sections, and of course your stat blocks are not huge. Your stat blocks have skill, stamina, weapon, armor, and the tracks for both. That's it. So it's really, really easy to run this game as a new GM. And in fact, I've been to conventions where I've sold a copy of this, a 2-day convention where I've sold a copy of this to a child of about 9. They went away and ran it for their younger brother that evening, and they came back to the convention the next day, so a weekend ticket, and they told me how much they enjoyed running. Again, they'd never run an RPG, they'd never played in an RPG, but they were able to read through this, get the rules, run the game for their brother. And from a hobby point of view, that is brilliant, because they are now a gamer, they're now a GM. So they are now able to make up their own games. Now, I have had a discussion the other day on Facebook where I pointed out my 10-year-old. He's run quite a few games of this for me and his sisters. And admittedly, one of the sisters, one of my daughters, did want to be a fairy riding a unicorn, but I think that's what happens when you're 6. But she understood the mechanics perfectly, despite being 6. And my older daughter, who's now 15, obviously can run it no problem, can understand it no problem. But if as a 9-year-old you're able to pick this book up and run it fairly simply, and even when we got to bits where he suddenly looked a bit confused, said, "Oh, I don't know how to adjudicate." I said, "Well, just think, how would you do it?" So he made it up. And because he made it up and it fitted within the rules, which are relatively straightforward, it all worked, and on we went. He had fun, I had fun, everyone enjoyed themselves. He is now into gaming, which can only be a good thing. So I'm going to leave it there. But if you are interested in getting into AFF, if you've never played it before, if you've played other games and you're interested in trying it, if you've never RPG'd before, get the quick start and give it a go, and it gives you everything you need to run through that session. Then if you like it, you can get a PDF of the full book, which gives you everything you need to play for quite some time. And I think I'll stop there. So until next time, good gaming.